It fulfilled what the Assyrians believed to be divine justice. Rebellion against Assyria was rebellion against the god Ashur himself. And above all, it sent a message. Palace reliefs show smiling Assyrian soldiers executing prisoners, archers shooting down fleeing enemies, warriors slaughtering captives without hesitation. These images were deliberately displayed to foreign envoys and tribute bearers so the empire's reputation would travel faster than its armies. The psychological warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. King Sargon II, ruling from 721 to 705 BCE, refined these methods further. Captives were bound in metal restraints and paraded through conquered lands as living trophies. Some bodies were dumped into mass graves. Others were left where they fell, rotting for months as scavengers fed, a warning that lingered long after the army moved on. Ancient historians recorded prisoners having limbs amputated, left alive to die slowly while others were forced to watch. For those under Assyrian rule, the message was unmistakable. Loyalty was not negotiated. Disobedience did not bring swift death, but prolonged, deliberate suffering meant to crush the will of entire populations. The terror worked so effectively that some cities, hearing of the Assyrian army's approach, executed their own leaders who had advocated resistance, sending severed heads to Assyrian commanders as proof of submission. Even survival after conquest offered no safety. Disease, slavery, and displacement defined life under Assyrian control. The empire perfected mass deportation on an unprecedented scale. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, historians estimate that roughly 4.4 million people were forcibly relocated, one of the largest forced migrations in human history. These deportations were calculated, not chaotic. Skilled craftsmen, scribes, and priests were removed from conquered cities and transported to Assyrian capitals to strengthen the empire. Farmers were sent to distant, depopulated regions, forced to cultivate lands whose original inhabitants had already been erased. Families were broken, cultures scattered, identities dissolved, all in service of an empire that ruled not just through force, but through fear engineered to last generations. The purpose was deliberate and precise. Assyrian deportation served two goals at once: to shatter local identities that might organize rebellion, and to redistribute human beings wherever they best served imperial needs. People were treated as resources, moved across the map like grain or livestock. After Sargon II captured the Israelite capital of Samaria in 722 BCE, he deported 27,280 inhabitants across the empire, primarily to the Assyrian heartland and to Media in modern Iran. These journeys stretched hundreds of miles and could take years to complete. Assyrian records show that the state provided limited provisions along the way, not out of mercy but practicality. Deportees were expected to arrive alive and functional, ready to work immediately. Families were moved together, but communities were intentionally fragmented, ensuring old loyalties could never reform into resistance. The biblical accounts of the Assyrian captivity preserve the terror of those who lived under this threat. Prophets described populations who understood that defeat meant more than conquest. It meant erasure. Homeland, culture, and identity could be stripped away in a single campaign. Archaeological evidence supports this reality. Sites such as Tel Hadid have yielded cuneiform tablets listing Babylonian and Aramean names, confirming that peoples from across the empire were forcibly resettled into foreign lands, mixed deliberately to prevent unity. For those left behind in conquered regions, survival meant servitude. Slavery in Assyria was harsher than in neighboring Babylonia. Babylonian slaves often worked as household servants with limited protections. Assyrian slaves were war captives with none. They labored in mines extracting metals for weapons, in quarries cutting stone for palaces, and on massive construction projects that fueled the empire's expansion. Children born to enslaved women inherited bondage automatically, creating a permanent underclass with no path to freedom. Disease compounded the suffering. Analysis of ancient latrines in Jerusalem from this period reveals parasites responsible for dysentery, evidence of widespread intestinal illness. Without sanitation or medical understanding, disease spread quickly through crowded cities. For deportees marching vast distances, slaves worked to exhaustion, and refugees fleeing advancing armies, sickness often killed more effectively than blades or spears. What made Assyrian rule uniquely devastating was the randomness of survival. A skilled potter might be deported to Nineveh and live comfortably crafting goods for royal workshops. His neighbor, a farmer with no specialized skills, could be enslaved and sent to die in mines. Another from the same street might be executed for resisting. There was no pattern to predict your fate. Survival depended on chance. Whether your skills were useful, whether your city surrendered in time, whether you stood in the wrong place when the army arrived. For nearly 3 centuries, the Assyrian Empire proved that systematic terror could build and sustain imperial power. From the 10th century BCE until its fall in 612 BCE, fear replaced loyalty with brutal efficiency. Rebellions were crushed, tribute flowed steadily, and the Assyrian heartland grew wealthy on the suffering of conquered peoples. But fear alone could not preserve an empire forever. When Babylonian and Median forces breached Nineveh in 612 BCE, Assyria collapsed with startling speed. The terror that had once enforced obedience ensured that no one rose to defend it. The city that had inflicted unimaginable suffering was destroyed so completely that later generations struggled to locate its ruins. To survive even a single day under Assyrian rule was to learn a brutal truth about civilization. Societies can function through cruelty, fear can replace loyalty, and power without mercy ultimately consumes itself. Faced with such an empire, would you have resisted, knowing the cost, or bowed to a force that seemed impossible to escape? Standing amid the shattered remains of Assyrian palaces today, the evidence still speaks. Stone reliefs continue to glorify violence. Inscriptions still boast of cities erased, bodies piled, enemies broken. Even in ruin, the empire's voice survives. The Assyrians ruled through terror, and they made certain that terror would outlive them. They carved their crimes into stone, displayed their brutality on palace walls, and recorded their cruelty with pride, not as warnings but as achievements. Long after their armies vanished, their message remained. Fear was their greatest creation. Empires built on mercy leave laws and traditions behind. Empires built on terror leave scars. Assyria left both. A civilization that mastered fear so completely that it ensured its own memory would never fade. Imagine a world where screaming never truly ends. Where men, women, even children learn to recognize the crack of iron-tipped spears against city gates the way others recognize birdsong. Survival has nothing to do with strength or intelligence, only luck. Luck that the Assyrian army marched elsewhere this season. Luck that your city surrendered fast enough. Luck that you possessed a skill worth sparing your life. Between the 10th and 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrian Empire turned the ancient Near East into a landscape of permanent terror, where fear was not a consequence of conquest, but its primary weapon. Voiceover, low controlled. Subscribe now because what the Assyrians did next reshaped warfare forever. The Assyrians were not merely brutal conquerors. They were engineers of a system so ruthlessly efficient that centuries would pass before the world saw its equal. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia along the Tigris, they built the largest empire the ancient world had known, stretching from the mountains of modern Turkey to the deserts of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast deep into Persia. But size was not their true power. What set them apart was their calculated use of terror as state policy, their transformation of war into an annual ritual, and their willingness to inflict suffering so extreme that even their contemporaries recoiled. The Assyrian war machine never rested. Before the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE, armies were seasonal, farmers who fought between planting and harvest. He shattered that model, creating the ancient world's first professional standing army. Soldiers trained year-round, were paid regularly, and existed for one purpose only: war. This changed everything. Campaigns could begin in any season. Multiple armies could operate at once. Long sieges became routine. Earlier kings like Shalmaneser III had campaigned almost non-stop, but after these reforms, Assyrian kings marched every single year, conquering new lands, crushing rebellions, or raiding already subjugated cities for tribute. For those under Assyrian rule, surrender brought no safety. Even obedient cities watched armies pass through each spring, seizing food, conscripting men, and demanding more tribute than before. The Assyrians called it administration. Their subjects experienced it as endless theft enforced by steel. To sustain this violence, the empire built roads not for trade but for speed. Supply depots stocked grain and weapons. Spies reported dissent before rebellion could breathe. When King Esarhaddon captured Memphis in Egypt, he claimed the city fell in a single day, proof of a system perfected for domination. There was no safe distance from war. Sons were taken. Crops were seized. Labor was forced. Resistance, even hesitation, invited annihilation. And yet rebellions never stopped. Babylonia rose again and again, knowing exactly what defeat meant. Cities across Syria and the Levant formed desperate coalitions, clinging to the hope that unity might succeed where submission never had. The professional Assyrian army crushed every challenge placed before it. Armed with iron weapons, advanced siege engines, and disciplined cavalry, it overwhelmed forces that should have been equal or superior. At the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, the Assyrians confronted a massive coalition of rival states, fielding thousands of chariots and infantry. Assyrian records claimed victory, and whether exaggerated or not, the result was unmistakable. The empire continued its expansion, unchecked and feared. Punishment under Assyrian rule was never hidden. It was performance. When a city rebelled, the response followed a brutal script. The army arrived and presented a choice: surrender immediately and live under Assyrian control, or resist and face annihilation. Those who chose resistance discovered that Assyrian threats were promises. After a siege, city leaders were dragged before Assyrian commanders and executed publicly. Kings and high officials faced flaying, skin cut from living bodies while crowds watched. The removed skin was nailed to city walls or draped over poles as permanent warnings. Soldiers and fighters were impaled on iron stakes, their bodies erected around the conquered city so that anyone approaching would see rows of dying men announcing Assyria's victory. Civilians were spared death, but not suffering. Women and children were sold into slavery or deported thousands of miles away. Some men were blinded, their eyes destroyed so they could wander as living reminders of rebellion's cost. Others were mutilated, branded forever as defeated enemies. Inscriptions from Ashurnasirpal II describe piles of executed defenders stacked outside captured cities, their remains displayed as monuments visible from afar. Public torture served clear purposes. It demonstrated the king's absolute power over life and death,